Hello and welcome to the MilVet Podcast. Your podcast hosts are Brendan Aronson and Tim Shaw. We are military veterans, entrepreneurs, and investors. Most importantly, we strive to empower military service members, veterans, and their families. We believe that every veteran deserves a career that fires them up, a career in which you can learn, earn, and build a world-class network. On this podcast, we interview civilian and military veteran leaders who are incredible founders, writers, thinkers, and investors. Our primary goal is to inspire you to achieve great things. Let's dive into today's episode.
Today, we're very privileged to welcome Taylor Lorenz to the podcast. Taylor is an American journalist and columnist for the Washington Post. She's a technology reporter who has written for the New York Times, the Daily Beast, Business Insider, and she's known for her writing about internet culture. Fortune named Taylor to its 40 under 40 list in 2020, saying that she has cemented herself as a peerless authority whose name became synonymous with youth culture online during her time at the Daily Beast and the Atlantic. Taylor's book, Extremely Online, The Untold Story of Fame, Influence, and Power on the Internet, was published by Simon & Schuster in October of 2023. Taylor is not a veteran, but we think her perspective on the internet, how it's being used for geopolitical ends, and its impact on American business are critical for veterans. So we asked her to join us today. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Taylor, to kick it off, at a high level, what are you working on today?
Yeah, gosh, I had a pretty busy week because I filed 2 stories already about one U.S. Influencer running for Senate here, and then another related to influencers in the big NATO summit. So just catching up a little bit, writing another TikTok piece coming up soon. But yeah, that's what I've got going on.
Cool. For the NATO piece, Brendan and I were talking about this before the call, but the podcast. I'm curious, why do you think NATO invited influencers, and do you see that in the growing future? They're obviously invited to like the RNC, the DNC, but national security is a rather recent phenomenon.
Yeah, there actually are a bunch more national security influencers than you might think. One person I talked to who was invited on the trip is this guy, Preston Stewart. He's actually in the reserves himself. He's a YouTuber who makes content about, military related stuff. A bunch of other content creators that were invited were really experts on sort of news, politics issues. NATO invited about 16 influencers, and then the State Department and Department of Defense also invited some of them. So I know it sounds funny, and when you hear influencers, people think of, a TikTok dancer or something, but a lot of these are really smart people. And there was a fighter pilot too, a woman there who asked, some pretty smart questions. They got all access to the NATO summit. They got to interview a bunch of the leaders. They also got to talk to Secretary Blinken and went to a briefing at the Pentagon. So they're starting to release their content this week and next.
I think that's really interesting for a few reasons. One is the Department of Defense has notoriously not been an organization that engages and works with the creator economy and creators in general. And second is I think they realize, because recruiting is at a crossroads and how we're really hurting with recruiting, that they need to tell their story and they need to do a better job of telling their story. And I actually think we could almost analogize the Department of Defense to 2 other industries that you have covered a lot, and that is traditional media and traditional entertainment in Hollywood, in the sense that they have been in positions of incredible power and prestige, and that they haven't had to use social media because it's like, well, we can just rely on people to kind of consume and use and buy our products. And so I think what I'd like to ask is, like, how do you see the creator economy evolving from here? You said in the past you think we're still at the starting point. I'm curious, do you still feel that way?
Yeah, I think that we're just seeing a huge transformation in the digital landscape. We're seeing the rise of a lot more personality-driven media. So, for instance, you're right. People probably don't want to follow brand handles for any institution, whether it's the military or a legacy media company. They want to hear from people like Michelle Curran, the fighter pilot, who's also an Instagram star and can, give you interesting information in a format that's really engaging. They want to learn about issues through people like that with a story to tell or with a connection that are real experts too in their area, rather than some reporter parachuting in and, writing some sort of overview of a story that might not be as interesting. I say that as a reporter myself. And so I think it's a broader shift away from institutions. And obviously that comes with some benefits and some real drawbacks. But I do think that the media environment is not getting less digital or less distributed. So I do think that we're still somewhat in the beginning of the broader shift.
I feel of all the institutions, the military might have the most challenging way of dealing with it, because so much of the military is we are building a team and no one gets special treatment. Whereas creators are grow an audience base, and because they have an audience, they get special treatment.
Exactly. It's all about you as an individual and your personal brand and building yourself sort of separately from the team. And as you mentioned, the military seems to be much more about teamwork for obvious reasons and not standing out. So I think it can be challenging. And it's hard for anybody to put themselves out there online and kind of develop your own voice and navigate the different platforms and people on those platforms too. I think that the military, much like journalism and other institutions, right, it's also politicized, and you also have a lot of people with opinions online. And so, it can be a hard area to navigate, I think, for anyone.
Brendan and I talk to a lot of military veterans. And one of the things we tell them is that in that transition, you have to find your identity. And the military gives you an identity, but when you transition, you have to struggle for, I tell people, like, it took me a decade to figure out who I am as a civilian. And a lot of your writing, reporting, and podcasts has talked about building a personal brand. And when veterans hear that, especially active duty, it's like, no, I'm a quiet professional. I'm a servant leader. What guidance would you have for veterans who have that mindset?
It's really hard. I think, as you mentioned, it's sort of antithetical to everything that you're taught, but it's so crucial. And I know how corny and difficult it can feel too, to put yourself out there. It almost feels, like you're full of yourself, or like, I think that's what people fear, is that they fear that they're seeming too big for their britches, or, corny, and people are going to laugh at them. I say, just get over that. Trust me. Just be authentic to yourself. I think a lot of these influencers that were at NATO this week are a good example of that. They're not out there trying to be someone they're not. They're sort of talking about their own expertise in different issues. And also think of who you are, and what you're interested in, and then build a brand around that. We are actually unique human beings, right? And some of us have different interests, even if it's a hobby, right? You can sort of build a brand around something you've maybe been interested in for a long time and never had the passion to, or never had the time to really explore. I think it's helpful to kind of like write it all out. I know this sounds weird, but some influencer told me that she did this exercise years ago, and I thought it was so helpful, where she kind of made this like almost like a little wheel, and it was just kind of all the things about her, like what makes her her, what unique knowledge does she have in different areas that other people might have, unique interests, and what about her, would people want to hear from? What about sort of the things that she knows or is interested in, would people want to hear from? So sometimes I think it can help, by writing it down.
A few things. Go.
Yeah, can I chime in with just a really obvious question for folks that, again, if they're not coming at this from the perspective of this being important, or they're coming at this from the silent professional perspective, this is such an obvious question, but I feel like it's relevant to pause for a moment and just ask it. Like, what are the benefits of building a personal brand? Like, why should someone do that? Like, why is it important in a business context for folks after they transition out of the military?
It's really important. I think that, again, we're just moving into this personality-driven world. It's very competitive job landscape. To stand out, you really need to stand for something. People need to be able to skim your online presence and have a idea of who you are, a picture of who you are. And of course, you want your professional self out there. But I think LinkedIn is a really good place to kind of start too and experiment. I think they've been doing a lot more to kind of allow people to kind of grow there as creators, where it's a professional identity, sure, but you can post, you can make videos, you can kind of just give a little bit more of who you are so that when you are applying for a job or if you're starting a business, you stand out, because it's really hard. Everything is so competitive right now online. And the people that are able to just have a very clear and compelling personal brand stand out, as opposed to some other people where it's like, who is this person? I Googled them and a bunch of random stuff came up, but I don't really get a sense of who they are.
I just want to provide some quick additional context for veterans that might be listening. I feel like the key difference between being a silent professional in the service and this notion of building a personal brand in the civilian business world is that in the military, you're guaranteed to be seen on a promotion board, right? And so you don't have to necessarily build that personal brand. Like, you are going to be seen for opportunities to advance in rank, for opportunities to get into a command position. But in the real world, like, people cannot hire you for a job. They cannot plug your business if they don't know that you exist. And right, so building this personal brand is this idea that the more people that know about what you're working on, know about what your goals are, and know that you exist, the more opportunities will come your way. So I feel like that's sort of like the key difference between the two cultures. And then just as a quick caveat, I feel like it's so important for founders to build a personal brand. It's been incredibly helpful for us building our businesses. But I actually have a bit of a hot take for folks that are transitioning directly out of the uniform. I actually do not recommend investing as much time into this specifically as I do in building your professional network through one-on-one conversations. I feel like where I see people go awry is if they are giving advice about things that they don't necessarily fully understand or haven't experienced or done themselves. And so I just wanted to provide that quick caveat. But Tim, I'll kick it back over to you.
That was great. Thank you, Brendan. A few things, Taylor, to riff off what you and Brendan were talking about. One is we're a big fan of writing things out. And I know Amazon is all about like that 6-page business plan. Like, we love that. We just think like writing things out gives you the opportunity to like reflect and really figure things out. The second is this whole macro meta movement from the 50s of like the organized man, the corporate. And then now where we're at is like, it's so atomic. It is the individual. And maybe it's too much the individual. Like, individuals maybe have like too much power. And you mentioned on another podcast, like, you can become president by having a large social following. In fact, they said in 2012, Obama, or 2008, Obama won because of social media. And they said that also in 2016. And so, and then you had mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, influencer running for senator. And so maybe it's too powerful. And I would actually love for you to kind of riff off that if you think that's the case.
Yeah, I do think it's gone a little awry in some ways, because a lot of people are, I think, as many people are realizing more and more, right? Some people are expert at building the personal brand and don't have that expertise to back it up. And sometimes you have the most knowledgeable people in the industry who are not the best at selling themselves, especially certain types of professions. And I even feel this with reporting. I mean, I cover internet culture, so I'm very out there, but I always think of this guy who I worked with at the New York Times, who's, I would argue, one of the best reporters out there. He's just a really heads down, investigative guy, like does these incredible investigations exposing corruption. And I think he has like 2,000 followers on social media, And so I think sometimes the skills required to be really good at certain jobs don't translate. And we're not all marketing experts. So I think it's about finding that balance and doing what you can, but also recognizing sometimes the loudest voices in the room are not always the most qualified.
I think that point is really important, because the loudest voices can get the most attention, but there might not be as much depth or like real kind of expertise. The other thing that's interesting is around creators is so broad, but there's creators who are on LinkedIn, there's creators who are on YouTube, there's TikTok creators, and so I'd actually love to kind of quickly get your feedback on the different platforms. And so you had talked about LinkedIn already, and that's actually where Brendan and I spend most of our times. Like, I don't even have a Instagram or TikTok account, but I'm curious if there's anything else about LinkedIn that you find fascinating, interesting, or not cool.
I think LinkedIn is the most interesting social network. When Elon Musk took over Twitter and started to make a lot of changes, I think a lot of people who previously used Twitter for professional connections and to kind of connect moved to LinkedIn. And so you have a lot of interesting people, especially in the tech space, in the internet space and marketing world. It's just a great place. It's all professional. There's still drama and crazy posts on LinkedIn. You see it, it's an entertaining enough platform. It's not all boring over there. But I think I think I'm bullish on it. Like, I think that it has potential, and I find myself spending more and more time there too, because it's a great place to get sources.
The thing about LinkedIn, two quick notes. One is some people think it's too professionally cringe. I think there's some, sometimes I worry that like I'm too professionally cringe too. The second thing is I talked to someone at LinkedIn and they said they are deliberate about trying to remove and not have political discourse, especially ones that are too much to the left and right. And I think that really helps with LinkedIn.
I think so too. It's funny. I also feel like you just have to kill the cringe. You just have to embrace your cringe, rather. Like, what is that? There's a saying like, kill the part inside of you that cringes or something. But once you get through that seal and become comfortable posting, I think you can make some really good connections on there.
It doesn't help that my 14 and 11-year-old like to use the word cringe. But I actually think that makes a great t-shirt. Kill your cringe?
Yeah. Oh God, I'm getting the quote wrong. It's like, kill the part inside of you that's cringe or that cringes, I think. It's basically saying embrace being cringe. We're all cringe. What is more cringe than the human experience? Like, we're all trying our best.
Love it. Embrace your cringe. How about X and Twitter? I know historically that's been your favorite.
I think as a journalist, it's always been my favorite. I mean, I was big into Tumblr back in the day, and I switched over to Twitter, and I don't love making videos as much. And so it's just an easy place to like kind of sound off. Now, I will say it's gotten a little bit more challenging because I think Elon has deprioritized journalism and sort of optimized it for other things. That said, it's still very politically relevant. So I do spend my time, there still, but less time than I did previously. I'm not ready to I'll never give it up. I mean, I'm too addicted. I also find it really, sorry, what were you saying?
No, please, Taylor.
I also just find it really helpful in terms of like breaking news. When something is happening, I still don't think there's any other platform that's been able to come along and replace it for that type of stuff.
I'm curious to hear a little bit about the suspension from Twitter by Elon in 2022. I mean, I just am curious to hear about what it was like to be singled out by one of the most influential and powerful people on the planet.
Yeah, Elon doesn't like me. I've done critical reporting on him over the years. Some founders, it's interesting, and some tech CEOs, like you'll report on them very critically, and they kind of understand the name of the game, but then they'll actually try to win you over. Like they're like almost more. It's weird the way they react. And then with Elon, he's reacted, very negatively. So I wrote a story. Essentially, I don't know if you guys remember, but he tweeted out this video of a man and had made a bunch of allegations about this man and said, like, anybody who can find him, like, let me know. Obviously, I found him in like under 12 hours. I interviewed the man about his version of events and also reviewed some security footage of some stuff. Basically, Elon had lied about this interaction with this man. Elon had already banned actually a bunch of other journalists, including my colleague Drew Harwell, who I think I did the story with. He's my main reporting partner. So I thought I might get banned, but my editor said, you still have to obviously reach out to him for comment. So I reached out to him for comment. I knew he had already banned like 5 other journalists. And I was like, I guarantee the minute I reach out for comment, because it was mentioning the Elon Jet account. He was banning everyone that had mentioned the Elon Jet account or reported anything about the Elon Jet account. Yeah. And within 2 minutes, I was banned. And then he tried to ban me because I had not violated anything. And unlike the other journalists, I actually hadn't posted about the Jet account. So he made this rule up that was like, I don't know if you guys remember, it was like, it only lasted over the weekend. And then it was like, you couldn't promote other social media platforms remember, he was like, you couldn't promote Instagram or YouTube too much on Twitter or you would get banned. Of course, this ended up being illegal in the EU. He had to reverse it right away, but that was technically the rule that I was banned under because I was aggressively promoting my YouTube channel at that time. Anyway.
It's like, if your name rhymes with Baylor Lorenz, you are not allowed on the platform. It's like, what kind of rule is this? This is like singling me out. I'm curious, just to build on this conversation. So Elon purchasing Twitter, Jeff Bezos now owns your publication as well, the publication you work for, the Washington Post. Should we be concerned about wealthy Americans purchasing media outlets? And like philosophically, I guess I'm just be curious to hear a little bit of context or color about what it's been like working at a publication that is owned by a billionaire.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think most publications I've worked at have been owned by billionaires. The Sulzbergers, I'm not sure if they're billionaires when I worked at the New York Times, but they're certainly up there. I worked at the Atlantic. Lorraine Powell Jobs owns that. Also, billionaire. I think it's a huge problem, and I'm very against, the corporate media being owned by all these billionaires. That's why I'm a huge supporter of independent journalism. I think it's a really important check on these corporate institutions because undeniably, they have different sort of constraints, right? I will say at the Post, we absolutely have never heard anything from Jeff Bezos. We have a fantastic Amazon reporter who does tons of critical coverage. He's been really great about staying out of the newsroom. But I think it's more of just like what billionaires expect from media companies, which is sort of a profit, right? They want these companies to turn a profit. And I think it's incredibly hard to build a profitable media business in the year 2024. So I'm a big supporter of also places like ProPublica and others that do a lot of really great nonprofit journalism.
Awesome. Tim, I'll kick it back over to you after this, but I just want to ask, I'm curious to hear a little bit about your own social media consumption, right? Like, I'm always a fan of recommending, especially for folks that are in transition or trying to figure out a new industry, that there are just certain things that you can do to make your educational experience really easy. Follow relevant influencers who are posting in the space, consuming different sorts of like long form content, whether it's written, video, etc. But I'm just curious to hear, how do you think about your own social media consumption?
Gosh, unfortunately, I'm such an addict. I consume a little bit of everything. So I love pop culture. So I'm always looking at stuff. I would say YouTube is the most helpful for me in terms of like learning and just going deep on things. I think YouTube, there's really nothing else that's been able to replace it. Like you can just find these really thoughtful, 2-hour long deep dives on specific topics. And it's a really good place to learn. I also think, it doesn't get mentioned as much in social media, but you mentioned this earlier, like newsletters are really great. I subscribe to a lot of newsletters that do a great job of sort of like filtering the internet. And I spend a lot of time there. I'm a big Instagram person just for fun. And TikTok, I think TikTok's also just like, gosh, it's just, you can find so many types of people on TikTok, and you can find so much interesting content on there. And there's a lot of how-to and learning content too. There's a lot of like life hacks type stuff on there. So I'm on everything. And of course, Twitter. But YouTube is always the one, like, I just think I've gotten so much out of that platform over the years.
Tim, I promise I'm going to kick it back over to you. I know you're chomping at the bit. But I do want to ask about TikTok since you brought it up. Curious to hear any thoughts that you have about the US ban of TikTok. I have my own personal opinions, but you're an expert, so I'd be curious.
My opinion is that the ban doesn't solve any of the problems that the government ostensibly has with the app. I think it's absolutely right to be concerned about China getting access to our data, right? But you can ban TikTok and China can buy as much data as it wants from third-party Facebook vendors and data brokers. And so I think if we aren't tackling the underlying problem, you're playing whack-a-mole. There's tons of Chinese ownership, by the way, in the gaming space, in the entire tech industry. Look at the investors in AI and all these Chinese investors. So, I think, look, it's a noble goal to try to get maybe foreign influence out of our tech sector, but banning a single app based off nothing because they've shown zero evidence. I would love these lawmakers to come out and show the evidence that they've seen. I think a lot of lawmakers that have been in these meetings, like Jim Himes and others, have put out statements saying, look, I'm in these national security meetings. I've not heard of anything. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned. But again, banning TikTok, and we have the next big app come up tomorrow. It's going to be, we need a more competitive tech market here. Number one, let's not forget that the reason we have TikTok in the US and it's not Musical.ly, because Musical.ly was trying to sell to a US company, is because we have such a monopoly and Meta was driving them out of business. That's why they had to sell to the Chinese ByteDance in 2017 in the first place. So I think we should keep innovation here, facilitate more competition here, and we'd have a much better landscape. But instead, we're running around and banning TikTok, which again is not going to prevent China from getting unlimited American data because we have zero data privacy protections in this country. So that's my feeling about that. Yeah. And I think it's such a fraught issue. And a lot of people are sort of like use it to push their whatever point they want to make about politics. But I've done extensive reporting on it. And so has my colleague, Drew Harwell, for years now. And there is just no evidence of what these lawmakers continue to claim. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried about what could happen. But I think we need to worry about protecting civil liberties too, and giving this, I'm sure you guys are familiar, but this law gives pretty unilateral power for the government and the executive branch to ban any website or app that they consider a national security threat without really proving that it's a national security threat. And so as a journalist, I really worry whoever we have in power. I don't trust politicians. That could be used to ban the Washington Post app if we publish the wrong government documents or something. So I think it's just so important to protect our civil liberties above all else. And national security is really important. And again, I think it's reasonable to ask these questions of TikTok or, focus on data privacy, but we can't just whack-a-mole our way out of it, if that makes sense.
This conversation is making me think about in World War I, there were folks who did not want to get drafted. And there was this big Supreme Court case afterwards that was like, hey, they could protest like their draft. And it's a very nuanced topic, but I just think that there's consensus right now in America that China is the enemy. And because of that consensus, anything that left and right can agree upon will happen. And so the challenging thing is they could be the enemy, but we could, as you mentioned, Taylor, create certain policies that actually hurt our democracy as we kind of overreach potentially. On that same concept is something that we think a lot about, and that is trade-offs. And so the trade-off of what we talked about earlier of having people who have so much power, right? Like it is now the primacy of the individual. And that's Elon Musk, right? And Mark Zuckerberg. But the interesting thing for that trade-off is there needs to be some counterbalance to that. And Taylor, you mentioned you love independent journalism. And we feel like it's up to now individuals to kind of counter those individuals. And the trade-off, another trade-off I want to talk to is, and maybe this is a poor analogy, is I felt like Snapchat was kind of the shadow to Facebook. And so now I'm curious, what do you think about Snapchat?
Yeah, I covered Snap so much in those early years and really through 2017, 2018. I think it's a perfect example of the monopolistic power of Facebook and what Meta did in aggressive ways. They cloned all of Snapchat's most popular features. They paid so much money to attract Snapchat stars, and all the talent that was building audiences on Snapchat was just cleaved off by Instagram and Meta and Facebook. I think that it's a shame that we didn't allow Snapchat more room to grow, because I think we would have a more competitive landscape. Now I think they're always kind of like fourth or fifth down the list. It is still a messaging app primarily for children, like teenagers rather. And it might peter along, but they're in pretty dire straits financially, and I don't know what their long-term future looks like.
It's the only social media app I let my 14-year-old have.
Well, yeah, it's nice I know it's very popular among that age group.
One of the things you've said too is that being a creator is not easy because you have to engage with your community. And a lot of the job is actually talking and fielding questions. And so I feel like that's a quote unquote shadow to being a creator. It's a lot of work. And so my question then is around maybe some platforms that you engage with your community. And so I'm curious what your take is on Discord.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Discord. I've been a lot of Discord servers. I got really into right when the early start of the pandemic. In early 2020, I got into playing Fortnite a lot with friends. And so I started joining a bunch of Discord servers for gaming. And then I just sort of started to find other ones for podcasts with different interests. And I am a big fan. What I like about Discord, and I think why a lot of more people are gravitating towards places like this and private spaces, is that you don't have that context collapse. You can talk with people who get what you mean. You don't have to go on Twitter and like talk to the whole world with every single post. And it's just more private. And I really enjoy it a lot. I think you can find some really interesting communities on there. I wish the discovery was better so that you could proactively find. Right now it's more like somebody has to invite you to something.
I'm going to reveal now that, I'm a late stage millennial, right? 41. And so this might be a terrible kind of analogy, but I always felt like Discord is like a cooler version of Slack. And so I'm curious what you think about Slack. Is that a good analogy?
I think that's a really good analogy. I mean, they function really similarly. I think Slack is always obviously just more used for like business case scenarios. And I know Slack for a while was trying to get non-enterprise users, but it sort of, that business didn't really manifest, I think, because Discord is free and much easier to use for a lot of young people. And also it has that gaming integration with it. But yeah, I mean, I use Slack all day for work. I am in one other Slack from this conference I went to years ago that they maintain a Slack that's pretty useful for finding tech people and stuff. But I think it's probably going to remain more of an enterprise corporate product.
This conversation around Slack and Discord makes me feel like, just like every kind of broad-based industry, there's going to be verticalization. So maybe there's going to be a verticalization of like social media for construction workers. I'm just throwing something out. And I'm curious, how crazy do you think that is?
I don't think it's that crazy. I think that you see a lot of these niche groups already develop, or communities online develop around common interests. And that's another thing that I think has changed a lot in the past 15 years of the internet and the content creator landscape. You used to just have all these like mass names to the point where like everybody knew who was the biggest on the internet, right? I think now if you ask somebody to name the top 10 biggest content creators, it's like, well, what industry, what realm are you talking? Entertainment? Are you talking, like there's so many, food, fashion, like military, right? Like there's so many different niche groups. So I think it would be interesting to see platforms. I think it's just so hard for any new platform to get any traction because Google and Meta will drive them out of business.
I quit Facebook when the whole Cambridge Analytics happened. It was just like, it was kind of like that. You went too far. But the only reason I really didn't want to quit was because of Facebook groups. And it just like makes me feel like the whole verticalization, like once you find a group within one of these bigger platforms, so if someone can figure out a way to like splinter off these platforms, or if Discord makes like discovery better, there's a potential that could be kind of verticalized. I'm curious now about Threads, because you've been talking a fair bit about Threads.
Yeah, I just wrote a big piece related to the 1-year anniversary of Threads and kind of why the platform has been struggling. Basically, what my piece argued is that they just have not had a breakout cultural moment, and their hesitation and kind of like open hostility towards news and politics, I think, has really hurt them because they're trying to replace Twitter. And that is what makes Twitter relevant, is that sort of news aspect of it, whether it's NBA Twitter or politics Twitter, it's the real-time news and information. Awards show, like Twitter is the place, right, to get the real-time tweets of who's walking down the red carpet. So Threads has really leaned away from that. The feed is not, it's much more similar like to the Instagram feed, where you're getting stuff that's 3 or 4 days old. Also, I personally think that Meta has just out of control levels of content moderation. I mean, I think because they got so much negative press after 2016, they have swung back the other way. And that is the one thing where I feel like I sound like Elon Musk when I start talking about it, but they really do go overboard on content moderation, which affects journalists. For instance, a colleague of mine, or she works at NBC, but she had a story that had the word, it was about AI revenge porn. And because it had the word porn in the URL, it was blocked from Threads. You couldn't even read that article. And so, there's just a lot of issues like that come up where they just sort of universally decided to block words or terms that they feel are associated with things, and there's no nuance. So
I want to tag it. If we're asking about our favorite social media platforms here, I got to ask, and I know you're a fan of anonymity in certain contexts for creators, but curious to hear any thoughts that you have about Reddit. I'm a fan of Reddit. I lurk on there. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that is the one app that I don't really post on, but I am a huge lurker. And I think that goes back to this desire for community. There are these really robust communities on there. And I do think it's kind of a sleeper social platform. It's very like forum-ish, obviously, but no, I spend a lot of time on there in different communities. And I think it can be really helpful. It's just a little bit hard because everyone is so anonymous. So you can't always unless you spend a lot of time in the community where you get to know who's reputable in terms of posting, it can be a little hard.
And then on the topic of banned words, I read this somewhere. I don't know if it's true, but is it true that you are the one that came up with the term "okay boomer"? Is that attributable to you?
I just wrote about it for the New York Times, but I know people, every time I write about things, people are like, "She made it." I'm like, no, I wrote about it because it was being used so widely on the internet. So I can't claim that, but I do think it's a funny phrase. I wrote that piece in 2019 for the Times.
Got it. Tim, back over to you.
I think my last question on social media platforms is Pinterest. Pinterest, I feel like gets no coverage now, but there's still a big audience there. So thoughts on that?
I think Pinterest is really, I think, also kind of a like, yeah, seventh or eighth down the list. It's not, I would say it's more of a tool. There are Pinterest influencers and people follow and stuff, but it's more of a discovery platform for content and e-commerce activity. So it is interesting. In that sense, it's kind of similar to a lot of these Chinese social networks. And that's why you see a bunch of Chinese companies launching these Pinterest competitors, or things like Lemon8, which is a Pinterest competitor by ByteDance that's been getting traction in the US. Like, I think this marriage of sort of e-commerce, product discovery, aesthetic, curation is a very powerful mix.
How, as a parent, I'm going to ask this. Do you think social media brain rot is as bad as they make it out to be?
No, I don't. I know parents will disagree with me on this every time I write this. I was writing this piece recently about this man, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote this book called The Anxious Generation that everyone's talking about. This man has absolutely no authority. Please do not listen to that book. None of those studies are so dubious. I thought Reason Magazine did an excellent breakdown. It is just it is hyperbolic nonsense that is not actually backed up by research. Now, I have to qualify. That doesn't mean that I don't think some of his recommendations are good. I do think that it's good to have kids not spend too much time away on any screen, right? Whether it's grew up in the age of television, right? And that, it's unhealthy. You want kids to get out there. You want kids to play. I agree with, I think one thing that Haidt talks about is this notion of independence, right? And that we've taken a lot of sort of autonomy away from our children, where we coddle them and we don't let them play around outside or fail or get lost, right? And then find their way. So I think that's true. But the notion that social media is what's responsible for this mental health crisis among young people, it's just more complicated than that. And I thought Candace Odgers, who's really the leading researcher on this exact topic, wrote a fantastic piece for The Atlantic, debunking a lot of what Haidt says and talking about the real structural issues that are leading to this mental health crisis among kids. I think the phones and the phone addiction is sort of like I don't know if there's such a thing as phone addiction, but the phones and the sort of like watching social media and all of that, it's more of a symptom of the problem rather than the problem itself. And again, that does not mean you should give your child unlimited access to the iPad. I know how it can be, but I think that there's a balance. And I think social media is just so great for kids that have a niche interest, or maybe, or have interests that are slightly different than the physical, kids around them at school. I mean, if you're into theater or anime or certain types of books, YA novels and stuff, like there are these amazing communities online where kids can connect with other kids. And obviously, I think it's really important also to expose kids to these platforms early, teach them media literacy. If you just ban kids from using social media until they're 18 and then it's a free for all, we're going to have a bunch of people that have no media literacy and can't use the internet. So it's all about moderation, balance, and smart use. And obviously parents also keeping a watchful eye as much as you can on kind of what your kids are doing online.
Balance and moderation. I mean, it's really hard as parents and for our kids, but I completely agree with that. Two quick questions, and I know Karina, April, and Rebecca have some questions. So the first is with Pinterest. The first company that I worked at as a civilian was a company called Pocket.
Yeah.
Yes, in 2014. So joined them when Nate, John Bruck, Matt Coyden, and I loved Pocket because it felt like it was like at the perfect intersection of media and technology. And like I was begging them, I begged them to have me join the team, and I'm so glad they let me. But Pocket, the struggle within Pocket in 2014 was how to have that virality as a save it later product. And we always compared ourselves with Pinterest because it was like Pocket was like smart people saving content online, offline, across devices, whereas Pinterest was there. We didn't dismiss Pinterest, but it was like Pinterest is for Midwestern mothers who are, saving images. And the pivot that we tried to do at Pocket in 2016, I wouldn't call it a pivot, but something we tried to do was like having you show the collections that you saved or the content that you saved. And it's just so hard to develop a social media. And I'll just stop there and am curious kind of how you think about that difference between saving and sharing.
Yeah, I think it's also just, I mean, I was such a Pocket fan. I curated so much stuff on there. I think that there's a really valuable role that a lot of people play on the internet as curators, where they sort of like collect these articles or interesting things to read. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of that is potentially going to be automated, or at least people are trying to automate it with AI. So it's more like, hey, give me a daily list of links of the top, tech articles of today, or sort of like using algorithms to surface interesting content rather than people. But I still think you just get much more interesting content when you rely on people. There's some sort of aspect to it that an algorithm, I think, can't replicate as well. But yeah, I think also just what hurt Pocket is this move away from the web and towards apps. I think that it was a very like web-based product, and now people primarily consume content through apps and platforms.
My last major set of questions revolve around Extremely Online. So we think this is one of the best books when it comes to understanding the history of online creator communities, creator content. And the first few chapters talk about two things that are really interesting. One was this whole social list amongst New York socialites. And when I read that chapter, I can't help but think about clout, right? Because like it was all like a social ranking. And when clout came out, people were like, oh, hell no. Like, you're going to rank people on their social stuff. And I feel like now I'm just going to stretch this analogy even more. People also had that reaction to Google Glass.
Mm-hmm.
But yet I feel like now, and then in another podcast, you said timing is everything. And so I'm curious, if someone came out with a clout or Google Glass, and I know Facebook has that, Meta has the Ray-Bans. I'm curious, like, what is your reaction if someone came out with a new social ranking?
Yeah, I think I think clout was so ahead of its time. That's one thing that got cut down in the book. And I could have written so much more about clout, KLOUT, which people, I don't know if people remember it. Even when I was talking about my book, people were like, a lot of young people don't remember this era, but it would give you this score. And it was an early way to try to catalog online influence, which is really hard to do. And to this day, it's really hard to do. And there is no sort of universal way to understand it. It's like, how do you rank something like that? So I think today, now that people recognize the value of online influence so much more, if they were able to do that successfully, it could be very useful. Back then, I think it was just too early. And same thing with Google Glass. Also, Google Glass just didn't look very cool. I think the Ray-Bans, like, it was smart for Meta to partner with someone like Ray-Ban, right? Where that they're going to have cool eyewear. The Google Glass was not as cool. It just had this weird little like piece of glass in the corner. It also didn't do the things that I would want it to do, right? Like capture video. I know it's a huge privacy violation. I still want some sort of glasses I can have where it just tells me when I met that person before, what that person's name is again. That is my biggest challenge. So I think there's a lot of things that we look for in wearables that it didn't have yet. And I do think that we are moving more towards this wearable internet world.
I definitely think so. And I think wearable internet the military might be the first to apply that, because everyone needs good eye lens. And that eye lens needs to be one that you can like see and identify vehicles, identify, enemy terrain and like navigate. So I think that could be really interesting. The other thing around what you wrote Extremely Online was how so much of how there's so much visceral negativity towards sometimes women creators. And it really kind of started with like mommy bloggers. Even then it was like, hey, this backlash is how dare they monetize them talking about their lives and careers. And I'm curious, do you still feel like that's the case today?
Yeah, I think there's unfortunately just so much misogyny on the internet and hate, and just people don't like hearing from women that are very outspoken and loud, and that's how a lot of these women content creators are. And I think it's a huge shame. I do think that there's more awareness of that now as well, though. So at least women creators are sort of prepared for it. And the platforms have sort of tried to mitigate some of it, not really successfully. But I think so many the ways that people think about influencer culture is synonymous with thinking of big women or women like Kim Kardashian, like she got really famous for taking selfies. And I wrote a piece recently that was on the 10-year anniversary of selfie being word of the year. And it's hilarious to go back and read some of the coverage in the media that was saying like, if you take a selfie, you're a narcissist and you're just all these crazy ideas. And it's now, of course, we're just like, no, we just snapped a picture of ourselves, right? It's not that deep. And I think we're seeing that sort of, cool down a little bit. But certainly in the early days, you had a lot of women putting themselves out there in a way that hadn't been. And I'm not a huge defender of Kim Kardashian, but I do think that era was defined by a lot of hatred towards women.
What I really liked about your book is that it's a great historical guide, but it does it through great storytelling. It's one thing to just tell the facts, but it's another thing to get into who these people were. For the socialists, it was Russian immigrants who weren't even in this community, right? And that were like putting the socialites, I think the word you described was like on their knees and making them cry. It's just fascinating how anyone can participate in this creator economy. The other thing is the selfie aspect. If one just walks through the Met or the MoMA or the Louvre, like we've been taking or painting selfies of ourselves since day one. I've asked a ton of questions. Want to hand the mic over to Karina, April, or Rebecca.
Yeah, I have a few questions. Hopefully they all relate to each other. But you mentioned Instagram is one of your favorite platforms, as is mine. Have you used the Meta AI search function that they recently implemented, and would you trust it as a reliable source?
Yeah, I actually haven't used it yet. I think, are you talking about I've used the image generator. I haven't used the search. Are you talking about within Instagram?
Yeah, within Instagram. I think they recently implemented it. I'm not sure if
I have that on my Instagram. Oh wait, ask Meta AI or search. Yeah.
Yes,
actually, I have used this. Yes, I do not love it. I think it couldn't. I was trying to find stuff one time. I was writing a story about these cat AI pages, and it didn't seem to understand what I was trying to communicate. I think Meta is behind on AI a little bit, but I think it could end up being very useful. But I haven't really dug in. I just used it once and was like, this doesn't seem fully cooked, so I'll wait a little bit. Have you found it useful?
I've played around with it. I would agree with you that I think they are a little bit behind in terms of like implementing that sort of AI. But I did want to go back to the personal brand question, because I personally am trying to build my own brand, as many teammates know, and it takes a lot to build someone's personal brand and following, and I feel like it can take one wrong sentence or one misunderstanding to crumble it all down. So how effective and successful do you find rebrandings? People might form personal brands based on what they're interested in or their circumstances in a period of their life. But we evolve. I don't want to limit myself to this brand or persona that I've created at that time. So how do you view it, and would you still view it as authentic? Because you mentioned, authenticity before.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's nothing more authentic than allowing your sort of brand to evolve with you as a person, as you grow. And certainly, we all change over time. So I think it's totally fine. I think it just depends on how to sort of introduce that new version of you to your existing audience and try to build those bridges so that you don't just kind of overnight, oh, hey guys, I'm all about this now, because then everybody will just sort of be like, oh, all right, well, I guess I'm not following that person or whatever, So I think it's about taking what transitioning it over and kind of having more of bringing people along for that journey, and sort of introducing it in pieces rather than just you wake up one day and everything is sort of a new you.
And I've also seen on Instagram and especially TikTok, you have like hundreds of thousands of followers. Do you find that as your following grows, more opportunities are opening up for you? And if you had the chance to potentially collaborate with any high influence person or company, what would it be?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, definitely as my following has grown over the years, my profile has grown a lot, and I think that that's been beneficial. At the same time, I would say that my work it's been very politicized. A lot of people only know who I am through hearing about me on Fox News or something. And I think that they don't actually engage with my work or read my book or anything, like and then when they do, they're like, oh, this is the person that you guys are like yelling about. Like, like I don't think that my writing is actually very controversial, but I think that people in the media with large audiences, obviously there's a lot of politicization, and I can be very outspoken. I have very loud opinions on the internet, so I get it. So I think that's been a challenge to navigate. And I think it's a challenge for anyone in the media to navigate. But overall, I'm very glad. The more people that read my work, the better, and the better stories I can find. So it's certainly been worth it. In terms of the person I'd most like to collab with, there's so many. I mean, I'm just a really big fan of a lot of the old school YouTuber type people, like the Hank Greens and the, just people that were there from the beginning that I think are really smart, interesting people. They're not maybe who you think of as like big content creator. I'm not trying to collab with Mr. Beast or something, but I guess I'll say Hank Green. I know him enough. I talk to him sometimes for stories, but I just think he's a cool person.
Okay, well, Hank Green, if you're listening, please.
He knows me. I don't know what we would do together, but I'm a big fan of his. What were you saying, Tim?
I think I actually met you first after you did a session at VidCon with Hank Green.
Yeah. I've done one. I did something with him, I think, or his brother too. I just saw John. I mean, they've been really helpful to me over the years in terms of boosting my work. So I'm just fans of them. I'm trying to think. I mean, most of the other content creators that I cover, I think, are really amazing, inspiring people. I just don't know what I would do with them. You know what I mean? So I'm also really inspired. I will say one thing that I love is, again, independent journalism. And I have a lot of friends that have gone into independent. I'm a huge fan of 404 Media, which is an independent tech journalism. I would love to do something with 404 Media. I mean, I'm just it's fantastic journalism. And they're 100% independent, reader funded. They scoop every mainstream outlet all the time. I think do really great tech coverage. So I guess I'd like to collab with them.
April, Rebecca, any questions?
Yeah, something I've been noticing a lot. So I love YouTube. I've been on there for a long time, and I shifted over to TikTok in the recent years. Obviously, it's just who can stay off of TikTok. But when I kind of go back to YouTube, I notice a lot of big creators kind of almost leaving the app or starting their own thing. Like Watcher recently had a pretty big controversy with their streaming platform, and then the Try Guys also announced that they're starting their own thing. And so it really made me think, it seems like it might be difficult to monetize and just support a full business just off of YouTube now, especially with TikTok and a bunch of other things. So do you have any advice or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think making a living full-time as a content creator through advertising revenue on these social platforms is unsustainable. I think it's really about using these platforms to build an audience and then convert that audience to something else, whether it's getting more business for the product or brand that you've launched, or funneling people into a newsletter, or a streaming platform like the Try Guys are doing, or other things like that. I just think that you can't make a living full-time doing sponsored content and relying on these algorithms, because it's like building a business on quicksand. I think look at these platforms as the marketing tools that they are, and use them to get out there, but don't rely on them, for a living. That makes sense, because it's very volatile. And I think you're seeing that even the biggest creators are realizing that, and that should tell you something.
Absolutely.
Taylor, chapter 10 about Vine, you profile Rudy Mancuso.
Yeah.
What I think is really interesting is he went from Vine to YouTube, but then most recently he's got a movie called Musica. I don't know if you've seen it, and it's really good. And it's just so interesting to see. He's one of the fewer, smaller examples. Obviously, there's a Logan Paul, those folks who have broken into mainstream, but I feel like he's one of the few that has actually made it there in the sense of a full film production, all that stuff. And so I think all these creators 5-10 years ago who were not well known are now being like real mainstream, and I think that's going to continue to be the case. So that's really cool to see. The other thing is there's a George Orwell quote. I'm going to butcherize it, and he's basically everything is politics, and so in this day and age, especially 2024, I feel like everything gets politicized. We like to say as a group, we will try to always avoid politics, but people inject it somehow. And for those who pick up extremely online, I'll just say there's hardly any politics, just great storytelling. So please pick up the book. And then I just want to really thank you for your time. This has been a very fun conversation. We think you are going to be, I'm not trying to be obsequious, one of the most important writers when it comes to internet media and journalism. Clearly, you've already kind of shown that you are. So thank you so very much. And we hope our listeners get a lot from this interview.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.